Hello, dear friends, good gentlewomen and good gentlemen. I bid you a good day, good morrow, good evening, and every possible message of good cheer. Thank you for being here. I have just concluded this novella, and although quite soon it will be published, it is my distinct honor to first present it to you, my friends. I have endeavored in this ghostly little book to write the ghost of an idea which shall not put you out of humor with yourselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt your houses pleasantly, and its contents increase within your hearts. And now I call it A Christmas Carol. Thank you. Where to begin? Marley. Marley was dead to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman and the clerk, the undertaker, the chief mourner. Scrooge himself signed it. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge, but there is particularly dead about a doornail. I would have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. Therefore, permit me to repeat emphatically, old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Well, of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for, I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, his sole mourner. Why, Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name above the warehouse door. There it stood, years afterwards, Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge, Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. And yet, I repeat, Marley was, well, dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of this story I'm about to relate. And now, back to Scrooge. Oh, what a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint from which no steel ever struck generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The very cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, which spoke out shrewdly in a grating voice. He carried his own low temperature always about with him, and he did not thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat or cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. After all, no wind that blew was bitterer than he. Nobody ever stopped him on the street to say, "My dear Mr. Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No child would stop him to ask, "Sir, what is it o'clock?" But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy, "Keep your distance." Once upon a time, well, we always need a once upon a time, don't we? Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. Now Scrooge kept the door of his counting room open, that he might keep his eye out upon his clerk, Bob Cratchit. A more honest soul in London was not to be found. Poor Bob, sitting in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, copying letters. Now Scrooge had a very small fire, but his clerk's fire was so very much smaller, it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it. Oh, no, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with a shovel for more heat, the master predicted it would be necessary for Mr. Cratchit to seek employ elsewhere. Whereupon the hapless clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. And then there was heard, "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" It was Scrooge's nephew who came upon him so quickly. It was the first intimation he had of his approach. He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and the frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome. His eyes sparkled. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" "Christmas a humbug? Uncle, you don't mean that, I am sure." "I do. Merry Christmas. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer? If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." "Uncle!" "Nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine." "You keep it, but you don't keep it. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge informed his nephew he would see him in that lower extremity first. Well, indeed he did. "But, Uncle, why?" "Good afternoon." "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing from you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon." "Well, I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute, but I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So a Merry Christmas, Uncle, and a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon." His nephew left the room without a single thought or word of anger, but stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season upon the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let two other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, who now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and they bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these past 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at this present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir." "Are there no prisons?" "Plenty of prisons." "And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?" "They are. Still, I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and poor law in full vigor, then?" "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you had said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course. I'm very glad to hear it." "Under the impression they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, A few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. What shall we put you down for?
Nothing.
You wish to be anonymous?
I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make other people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough. Those that are badly off must go there.
Many can't go there, Mr. Scrooge. Many would rather die.
If they had rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Seeing clearly it would be useless to pursue the point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself, and the fog and the darkness thickened. At length the shutting about of the counting house arrived. Loath to close its doors, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
You want all day tomorrow, I suppose?
It's quite convenient, sir.
It's not convenient and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound. And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work.
It's only once a year.
Poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning.
The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out muttering loud enough for all to hear. The office was closed in a twinkling. Bob Cratchit ran off and went down the slide on Cornhill at the end of a later voice 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve. Whee! Then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at blind man's bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers, beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers that had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a building that was old enough and dreary enough, for nobody lived in them but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door of Scrooge's house, except that it was very large, and Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little about him of what is called fancy as any man in the city of London, and yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, with a dismal light about it like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with his ghostly spectacles turned up upon his ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. He said, "Bah!" and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. Up Scrooge went, not carrying a button, for it's being very dark. Darkness is cheap. Scrooge liked it. But before he closed his heavy door, he went through all his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, slumberer. All's as it should be. Nobody in the closet, although his nightgown was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. No matter. Quite satisfied, he closed his heavy door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown, slippers, and nightcap, and sat before the very low fire to take his gruel. Scrooge's glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room, which had communicated for some purpose, now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great anticipation and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, the bell began to move slowly back and forth. Clang, 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 clang. See, the rang so loudly as every other bell in the house. Clang, clang, clang. This was succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. And then he heard the cellar door fly open with a booming sound. Then the noise much louder on the floors below. Then coming straight towards his door. It's humbug still. I won't believe it. Then before his very eyes came a spectre through that heavy door, and upon its coming in the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, I know him, Marley's ghost. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle, and it was long and wound about him like a tail. And it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, and heavy deeds and purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him, looking through that same waistcoat, could see 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels. He never believed it till now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and through, and felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and even noticed the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, it still lay beyond his belief.
How now? What do you want with me?
Much. Marley's voice still doubted about that.
Who are you?
Ask me who I was.
Who are you then?
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Can you sit down?
I can.
Then do it.
The ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me?
I don't.
Why do you doubt your senses?
Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be a bit of undigested beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are.
As Scrooge said this, he started to rise from his chair, but the spirit let out such a great cry, "Oh!" Instead, Scrooge held on tight to save himself from falling into a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off its wrapper as if it were too warm to wear indoors, had its lower jaw drop down upon its breast.
Dreadful apparition! Why do you trouble me?
Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?
I do. I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death.
You are fettered. Tell me why.
Aye, well, the chain I forged in life, I made it link by link and yard by yard, and I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him on the floors in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by 50, 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing.
Jacob. Oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I have none to give. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me! In life my spirit never roamed beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and never knew any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Never knew that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunities misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I.
But you were always a good man of business, Jacob.
Business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. Hear me. My time is nearly gone. I came here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my own procuring Ebenezer.
You were always a good friend to me, Jacob. Thank you.
You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Scrooge's jaw dropped nearly as deep as Marley's had.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? I think I'd rather not.
Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path they tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1.
Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob?
Look to see me no more, and for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us. When these words had been spoken, the phantom picked up its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. The apparition walked backward from him, and with every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. Scrooge became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. The air was filled with phantoms wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Many had been personally known by Scrooge in their lives, but the misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power to do so forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home alone. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door, which was double bolted as he had locked it with his own hands, and those bolts were undisturbed. And being from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the lateness of the hour, he went straight to bed and fell asleep upon the instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking at a bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque wall of his chamber. Suddenly the hour bell sounded a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy one. Light flashed up upon the room, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like that of an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. It held a branch of fresh green holly in one hand, and in singular contradiction to that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summery flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher, a cap, which it now held under its arm.
Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
No, your past. The things you will see with me are shadows of the things that have been. They will have no consciousness of us.
What business brings you here?
Your welfare. Rise and walk with me. It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that he is clad but lightly in slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap. The ghost's grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. Scrooge rose, but finding that spirit made toward the window, clasped its robe in supplication.
I am a mortal and liable to fall.
There, by the touch of my hand there, you will be upheld in more than this. As these words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood in the busy thoroughfares of a city, and it was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time and it was evening and the streets were gaily lit. The ghost stopped by a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
No, I was apprenticed here.
They went in. An old gentleman in a Welsh wig was sitting at such a high desk, had he been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling.
What? It's old Fezziwig. It's old Fezziwig alive again.
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat. Yo-ho there! Ebenezer! Dick! A young Scrooge came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice, Dick Wilkins. Yo-ho there, my boys! No more work tonight! Christmas Eve, Dick! Christmas, Ebenezer! Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson! Clear away, my lads, and let's have more room here! This was done in a minute. The floors were swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as any person would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to that lofty desk and made an orchestra of it. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came all the young men and women employed in the business there, some shyly, some boldly, some graciously, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came anyhow and everyhow. And there were dances, and there were forfeits, and then more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus too, and a great piece of cold roast, and a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came when the fiddler struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. A top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 or 20 partners. Ha! Even had they been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig would have been a match for them. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and with every person shaking hands individually as he or she went out, wished them a Merry Christmas. When everyone had retired but the 2 apprentices, they did the same to them. The former Scrooge trimmed down the lamps, and the voices faded away, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air.
A small thing to make these silly folks so full of gratitude.
He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps.
Is that so much he deserves this praise? It isn't that, Spirit. It isn't that. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. The happiness he gave is quite as great as if it had cost a fortune.
My time grows short, said the ghost. Quick! This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again, Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve.
What idol has displaced you?
Demanded a young Ebenezer. A golden one. You fear the world too much. I have watched your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed toward you. Have I ever sought release from our engagement? In words, no, never. But you have changed. If you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe you would choose a dowerless girl? I release you with full heart for the love of him you once were. And so she left him.
Spirit, show me no more. Why do you delight to torture me?
I told you these were shadows of the things that have been. That they are what they are. Do not blame me.
Remove me. I cannot bear it.
Scrooge, observing the spirit's light burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence on him, seized the extinguisher cap, and with a sudden action pressed it down upon the ghost's head. The spirit dropped beneath it, and yet the light, undiminished, streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. Returned to his bedroom, Scrooge was overcome with exhaustion and an irresistible drowsiness, and could barely reel himself off to bed before sinking into a deep, heavy sleep. Awakening in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge did a quick appraisement of his present whereabouts. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. Hanging everywhere were crisp green leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy, reflecting back light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered here and there. Their sauce, such a roaring blaze up that chimney as that dull petrifaction of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time. Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with its delicious steam. And then, sitting in easy state on a couch, was a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike that of Plenty's horn, and held it up high to shed its light on Scrooge, come peeping round the door. Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me. The ghost was clothed in one simple deep green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. His garment hung so loosely on the figure, its capacious breast was bare. His feet, observable beneath the ample folds of his garment, were also bare. And on its head, the only covering it wore was a holly wreath set here and there with shining icicles, and its dark brown curls were long and free. Free as its genial face, its sparkling eyes, its opened hand, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. You have never seen the like of me before?
Never.
Never walked forth with the younger members of my family, for I am very young, my elder brothers born of these later years?
I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit?
More than 1,800.
A tremendous family to provide for.
The ghost of Christmas present rose. Touch my robe. Scrooge did as he was told and held to it fast. The room and all its contents vanished in an instant, and Scrooge and his giant ghost were upon the snowy streets of Christmas morning. Being made invisible, they went straight to Bob Cratchit's house and found Mrs. Cratchit, dressed out, but poorly, in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6 pence. She was laying the cloth, assisted by Miss Belinda Cratchit, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into a saucepan of potatoes to taste their mettle. And now in came 2 small Cratchits, a boy and a girl, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and knew it for their own. And Mrs. Cratchit exclaimed, "Whatever's got your precious father then and your brother, Tiny Tim?"
There's father coming,
cried the 2 small Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. In came Bob, with his threadbare clothes, donned and brushed to look seasonable, with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for poor Tim! He bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. The 2 young Cratchits hustled Tim and bore him off to the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
How did little Tim behave?
asked Mrs. Cratchit.
As good as gold and better. Somehow he gets awful sitting by himself so much, and he thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home today that he hoped the people in the church saw him because he was a cripple. That it might be pleasant to them to remember on Christmas Day who it was made lame beggars walk and blind men see.
Bob's voice shook when he said Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back he came, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. And while Bob compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemon, and turned it round and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued, you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course. And, in truth, there was something very like it in that house. Oh, there never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for a whole family. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses to take up the pudding and bring it in. Then a time-honored anxiety for the conscientious cook came upon our dear Mrs. Cratchit.
Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should be breaking, turning out. Suppose somebody should get over the wall in the backyard and stole them while they were making merry with the goose.
All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit returned, smiling proudly with the pudding so hard and firm, and blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob said he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought at all too small a pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth clear, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were placed upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts upon the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, and Bob served it out with beaming looks while the chestnuts sputtered and crackled noisily upon the fire. Then Bob proposed a toast.
A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us. God bless us, everyone, said Tiny Tim, who sat very close to his father's side on his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his as if he loved the child and dreaded that he might be taken from him.
Spirit,
said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before,
tell me if Tiny Tim will live.
I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. Oh, no, no, Spirit, please tell me that he will be spared. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none of my race will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. It may be in the sight of heaven that you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but raised them speedily upon hearing his name. Mr. Scrooge, said Bob. I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast. The founder of the feast, indeed, cried Mrs. Cratchit. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon. I hope he'd have a good appetite for it. My dear, the children, Christmas Day? That shall be Christmas Day, I'm sure, when one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows better than you do, poor fellow. My dear, Christmas Day? I'll drink to his health for your sake in the days, but not for his. Long life to him. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Be very merry, very happy, I've no doubt. The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings that had no heartiness on it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family, and the mention of his name cast a dark shadow upon the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. But when it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. And the jug and the chestnuts went round and round, and by they had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eye on them, especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. It was a great surprise to Scrooge to hear that hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as that of his own nephew, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the Spirit standing smiling by his side and looking at that same nephew. He said Christmas was a humbug, as I live. He believed it too. More shame on him, Fred, said Sarah, Fred's pretty young wife. Well, he's a comical old fellow, that's the truth. Not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, though I have nothing to say against him. And I feel sorry for him. I couldn't be angry at him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it to his head to dislike us and not want to come and dine with us. What's the consequence?
You don't lose much of a dinner."
"Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Sarah. It was the company's turn to laugh now at the notion of Scrooge's indomitable ill temper. But being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, the evening continued on unabated with many games, songs, and overall merriment. And when Scrooge heard Fred shout out a toast, "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man," the whole scene passed away, and Scrooge and the ghost were again upon their travels, and much they saw and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. Scrooge could not help but notice, while he remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoken of it until he saw its hair now gone gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?"
"My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight at midnight. Hark, my time is drawing near."
"Spirit, forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?"
"It might well be a claw for all the flesh there is upon it. Look here!"
From the foldings of its robe it brought forth two small children, a boy and a girl, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable, who clung upon the outside of the spirit's garments. With graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints. A stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. Scrooge started back appalled. "Spirit, are they yours?"
"They are man's. Beware them both in all of their degree. But most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Deny it and bide the end."
"Have they no refuge? Have they no resources?"
"Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?"
The spirit, bestowing his final weight, vanished in an instant. And without a moment to reflect, the clock struck 12. Scrooge remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him, slowly, gravely, silently. The very air through which this phantom moved seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible, save for one outstretched hand. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come." The spirit made no reply, but pointed onward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of its garment contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received, but Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind that dusky shroud were ghostly eyes intently fixed on him. "Lead on, spirit, lead on. The night is waning fast. It's precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." They scarcely seemed to enter the city, but there they were in the heart of it, on Change Street amongst the merchants. The spirit stood by one little knot of businessmen. Observing its hand pointed towards them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk.
"No,"
said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead. When did he die? Last night, I believe. I never thought he'd die. What's he done with his money? I haven't heard. Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, it's all I know. It's likely to be a very cheap funeral, for upon my life I don't know anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer. I don't mind going if a lunch is provided. But I must be fed if I make one. Goodbye. Bye. Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked toward the Phantom for an explanation, but the Phantom was pointing to two persons meeting. How are you? How are you? Well, old Scratch has got us all at last, eh? Said the first. So I'm told. Cold, isn't it? Seasonable for Christmas time. Good morning. Not another word. That was the meeting, the conversation, the parting. Scrooge glanced about that very place for his own likeness, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes who poured in through the porch. They left this busy scene and went to an obscure part of town, to an old shop where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. A gray-haired rascal nearly 70 years of age sat smoking his pipe. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too. And she was closely followed by an undertaker in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. Look here, old Joe. Here's a chance if we all three haven't met here without meaning it. You couldn't have all met in a better place. What have you got to sell then? What odds, Mrs. Dibble? What odds? Half a minute's patience, Joe, you shall see. Every person's got a right to take care of himself. He always did. Oh, who's the worse for loss of a few things like these, eh? Not a dead man, I suppose. If you want to keep him after he was dead, the wicked old screw, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had, he would have had somebody with him instead of lying gasping at his last alone by himself. It's the truest word I ever spoke, chimed in the second woman. It's a judgment on him. Undo my bundle, Joe, let me know the value of it. But the gallantry of her friends would not allow of this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breach first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive, a seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added the total when he found that there was nothing more to come. Mrs. Dibble was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. And now undo my bundle, Joe. Joe dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. What do you call this? Bed curtains? You don't mean to say you took them down, rings and all, with him lying there? Yes, I do. Why not? And don't drop that oil on the blankets. His blankets? Who else's, do you think? He's likely to take hold without him, I dare say. I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh? Don't you be afraid of that. I ain't so fond of his company I'll be loitering about him for a few such items like these if he did. You can look at that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole nor a threadbare place in it. It's the best one he had. A fine one, too. They would have wasted it dressing him up in it if it hadn't been for me. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. Spirit, I see that The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heavens, what is this? He almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which beneath a ragged sheet, unwashed, unwept, uncared for, lay the body of this plundered, unknown man. Scrooge looked to the phantom, but the phantom stood there with its steady finger unmoving, pointed towards the head. Spirit, I understand you, and I would do it if I could. But I have not the power, Spirit, I have not the power. But, Spirit, I beg you, let me see some tenderness connected with the death, or that dark chamber which we left just now will be forever present to me. The ghost conducted him to poor old Bob Cratchit's house, and found Mrs. Cratchit and the children seated round the fire. The noisy Cratchits sat still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were quiet. The mother laid her work upon the table. Color hurts my eyes and makes them weak by candlelight. Oh, and show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for all the world. Must be near his time. I think he's walked a little slower these last few evenings, Mother, said Master Peter. I've known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter. And so had I, exclaimed another, and so had all. He was so very light to carry, and your father loved him so. It was no trouble at all. But there's your father at the door. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got up on his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, Father. Don't be grieved." Bob was cheerful with them, spoke pleasantly to all the family. He noticed the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. You went today then, Robert? Yes, my dear. I wish you could have gone. Would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him we would walk there on a Sunday. My little child. My little child. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. Bob left the family, went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Bob sat down on it, and when he had composed himself and thought a little, he kissed the child's face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and he went down again. Spirit, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know it not how. Tell me what man that was that lay upon the bed. The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed Scrooge to a dismal, wretched, ruinous churchyard. The spirit stood amongst the graves and pointed down to one. Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of the things that may be only? Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which if persevered in, the ends must be. But if the courses be departed from, the ends must change. Say it is thus with what you show me.
The spirit was as immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name.
Ebenezer Scrooge! Am I that man that lay upon the bed?
The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again.
No, spirit! Oh, no! Hear me! I am not the man I once was! Why show me as if I am past all hope? Oh, good spirit, assure me I may change the shadows of the things you've shown me by an altered life. I will honor Christmas in my heart. I will try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may wash away the writings on this stone. And there began the alteration of the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down to a bedpost. Yes, the bedpost was his own. The bed curtains were his own. Ha ha ha! They are not torn down. They are not torn down, rings and all. Ha ha ha! They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will. Ha ha ha! Really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh, a most illustrious laugh, the father of a long line of brilliant laughs. Oh, I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know where I am. I don't know anything. He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clash, clang, ding, dong, hammer, bell, bell, hammer, dong, ding, clang, clash. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, no night, clear, bright, golden day. Scrooge called downwards to a boy in Sunday clothes. What's today? Eh? Returned the boy. What's today, my fine fellow? Today? Why, Christmas Day. Oh, it's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Well, of course. They can do anything they like. Oh, I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. Merry Christmas to everybody. Happy New Year all around. Hello, my fine young fellow. Hello. Do you know the poulterers on the next street but one at the corner? I sure hope I did. Oh, what an intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, but the big one? What, the one as big as me? Yes! Oh, what a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes! It's hanging up there now. Is it? Go and buy it and tell him to bring it here that I might give him direction where to take it. Come back with the man and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know who sends it. Scrooge went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As he stood there, awaiting his arrival, the knocker, old Molly's knocker, caught his eye. I shall love it as long as I live. I scarcely ever looked at it before. What an honest expression it has on its face. It's a wonderful knocker. Huh? Here comes the turkey. Hello, whoop. Merry Christmas. How are you? It was a turkey. He never could have stood up on his own legs, that bird. He would have snapped them short off in a minute like sticks of sealing wax. What? It's impossible for you to carry that to Camden Town. You must have a cab. And the chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle when he sat down in his chair, breathless, again. And chuckled till he cried. At last he got himself dressed all in his best and got out into the streets. The people by this time were pouring forth as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present.
and walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, "A good morning to you, sir! A Merry Christmas to you!" Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far, however, when he beheld coming towards him the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting house the day before. It sent a pang across his heart to think how that old gentleman would look upon him when they met. But he knew a path lay straight before him, and he took it.
My dear sir,
Here Scrooge grabbed the old gentleman by both his hands.
how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you, sir. A Merry Christmas to you, sir.
Mr. Scrooge?
Yes, that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you, and allow me to ask your pardon. And will you do me the goodness?
Here Scrooge whispered into his ear. Lord bless me, Mr. Scrooge, are you quite serious?
If you please, and not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor?
I will.
I thank ye 50 times. Bless ye!
Scrooge found himself near the open door of a church. He went inside, and for the first time as a man, joined his voice to those of his fellow creatures in a Christmas hymn.
God rest ye, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay.
In the afternoon, his steps turned towards his nephew's house. He must have passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash and he did it.
Fred?
Bless my soul, who is it?
It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in?
Let him in? It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be hard here. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next day. Oh, he was early there. If he could only get there first and catch Bob coming in late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon. Oh, delightful irony. And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. Ha! He was a full 18.5 minutes behind his time. Scrooge kept his door wide open that he might see Bob coming in late. Suddenly Cratchit was there. His hat was off before he opened the door. His comforter too. And he's on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
Hello? What do you mean by coming in here this time of day?
I'm very sorry, sir. I am behind my time.
You are? Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please.
It's only once a year. It should not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'm not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, I'm about to raise your salary, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge privately delighted in Bob's expression of astonishment and concern.
Oh, a merrier Christmas, Bob. A merrier one than I've given you, my fine fellow, in many a year. I'm about to raise your salary, and I'm going to endeavor to assist your struggling family. We'll discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. Now make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was as a second father. And he became as good a friend, as good a master, as good a man, as the good old city knew. Or any good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him. But his own heart laughed. And that was quite enough for him. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that truly be said of us, of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. And with that, my dear friends, I concur with our beloved Tiny Tim and Mr. Scrooge, and I wish for each and every one of you the merriest Christmas, the happiest New Year, and may each one of you be wonderfully blessed. And with that, and your consent, I take my leave.